Meanwhile, wheat prices rising sharply Monday following that strike. Wheat futures in Chicago jumped 8.5%, and corn futures rising almost 5%. But the prices have already been rising this past week since the Black Sea grain deal was abandoned by Russia. That will tighten up grain supplies, given that Ukraine is still one of the world's largest grain exporters. Economists say food inflation that's been easing for a few months could creep up once again, and people in developing nations will be hit the hardest. According to the UN, almost 60% of food exported from Ukraine over the past year went to developing countries, and just over 40% to developed nations. Well, to discuss this further, and joining us is Jack Bobo. He is the Director of Food Systems Institute at Nottingham University in the UK. Jack, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
I want to get your reaction to the way the Black Sea grain deal unfolded. Did everyone see that coming? Russia's been increasingly, one could argue, more difficult. Certainly that's the way the international community has been looking at it. Did this catch anybody off guard?
Yeah, I think people expected that the grain deal would be extended, and that the market certainly hadn't calculated in the fact that it was going to be shut off, and so you saw that sharp rise in prices when they did end the deal.
Okay, so explain the significance of this stop, of the deal. How much the grain was held up in ports when the deal was even in effect?
Yeah, so, Ukraine is one of the largest grain exporters in the world. They have about 10% of the global market. And so when this grain deal, or when the grain got stuck, that meant that there's this huge gap in the global market. And immediately the markets reacted because they knew that this is coming into a very critical time as we're getting closer to the harvest time.
Now, Russia has been arguing that its exports of not only grain but fertilizer as well have been adversely affected. From the international standpoint, does that hold water?
Well, there is no ban on exports of fertilizer or grain from Russia. However, there are limitations on the ability to use the banking system for Russia because of what's happening in the war. And so it does make it more difficult for Russia to be able to export its grain and its fertilizer. There have been attempts over the last year in order to work that out with the banking system, but as of yet, no deal has been done that would allow them to access that, and so that's part of their complaint, is that they're putting additional pressure to open up their exports as well. But the current blockage also keeps their prices higher.
You know, Jack, I think one could also make the argument that this conflict in many ways is expanding beyond its borders, because so many have been warning about a human disaster with foodstuffs. As this continues to drag on, shortages, now they've shut down. How bad is it, and what do you think the short-term and long-term outlook is?
Yeah, well, I mean, we already had about 800 million people globally who were food insecure. And right now, we have about 80 million people that are acutely food insecure, according to the World Food Program. So it's definitely a crisis that's happening. And those are countries that are in places like Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, that are large importers of grain from this region. And so those countries that are sort of in the worst situation today are going to be the most impacted by these decisions.
You know, those nations you just talked about, I think even the casual observer these days, with the hottest summer on record all around the globe, what role is climate change playing in all this? And certainly the short-term outlook is not good.
Yeah, I mean, climate change is playing a big role. The countries that I just mentioned are suffering from drought. And so adding on to that, the inability to access global grain markets is just going to exacerbate the problem. We have one of the hottest years, perhaps the hottest year ever on record. Every day, countries are setting records for high temperatures. And so that's certainly going to make it more complicated to get ourselves out of this situation.
Now, obviously, the UN has been weighing in as much as possible, and it's also concerned about the countries that are hit hardest by food shortages. What are we hearing from the UN, and do you expect that that agency is going to have any significance, any success in trying to head off this disaster?
Well, there certainly were efforts. The Secretary General was opening the UN Food System Summit stock taking just today, and was calling on Russia to end its escalation in Ukraine. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like that's likely to happen. The president of Turkey last week said that he was going to engage with President Putin in order to ask him to reinstate the grain deal. Obviously, that didn't happen with the attacks on the grain stores near the
Danube.
the Danube.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to leave this interview on such a negative tone. Are there any bright spots out there, any global efforts out there to elevate these issues?
Well, I mean, it's definitely with the attack today that turned some glimmers of hope in statements from President Erdogan and the Secretary General have really reversed that. And so I think at the moment we're in a situation of really great instability, and I don't think, unfortunately, we have a easy out at the moment.